Dorian had heard it all before. The whispers, the smirks. The so-called golden boys of Richmond High thought they had him figured out. A quiet new black kid, easy to push around. But what they did not know was that Dorian had spent years training, years controlling himself. And when Bryce Tanner shoved him one time too many, the lesson came fast, brutal, and unforgettable. Because Dorian was not just another new kid, he was a fighter. And today, they would learn that the hard way. The bus ride stretched on for hours, the world outside shifting from the familiar buzz of city streets to the slow, controlled order of the suburbs. The roads were cleaner, the houses bigger, the silence heavier. Dorian leaned against the cool glass of the window, watching as everything changed. His mother had called it a fresh start. His uncle had called it something else. Do not let them decide who you are before you get the chance to show them. Dorian did not respond when his uncle told him that. He already knew the truth. A fresh start was impossible when you looked like him. As the bus pulled up to Richmond High, the first thing he noticed was how different it was from his last school. The buildings were newer, the students dressed in expensive-looking clothes, and the parking lot was filled with gleaming cars, mostly trucks, mostly with lifted suspensions. He could already feel the weight of the stairs before he even stepped off. The second his sneakers hit the pavement, the shift was obvious. Conversations slowed. A few students glanced his way, then looked away quickly, as if they had not just been watching. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and kept walking. He did not need to hear what they were thinking. He already knew. Inside the school, the halls were filled with students, but none of them acknowledged him. Not directly. They looked from the corners of their eyes, whispered as he passed. A teacher handing out schedules at the front office forced a polite smile as he approached. "Dorian Carter?" He nodded. "We are so happy to have you here at Richmond High." She was lying. He had seen that smile before. It was the kind people used when they were trying too hard to look comfortable, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. She handed him his schedule, rattling off directions to his first class. "If you need anything, do not hesitate to ask." He nodded again. He would not be asking. As he moved through the hallways, the feeling of being watched settled deep under his skin. The quiet pauses in conversation, the subtle shifts in body language. He caught all of it. He was used to it. The first few classes passed without much issue. Teachers introduced him as our new student, their voices just a little too cheerful, their smiles too tight. Some students were curious. A few nodded at him. Others simply ignored him. By lunchtime, though, things had changed. He stepped into the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning the room for an open seat. Most tables were already full, packed with tight-knit groups, locked in conversations. No one looked his way, not directly. But as he moved past, he caught the glances, the whispering, the small smirks exchanged between students. He spotted an empty seat near a guy who was too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It was not ideal, but it would do. Before he could sit, a voice cut through the noise. "You lost?" Dorian turned, meeting the gaze of a blonde kid with an easy smirk and too much confidence. He leaned back in his chair, his friends watching the exchange with mild amusement. Dorian exhaled slowly. "Did not know I needed a map," the kid chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here." Dorian caught the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken part of that sentence. He met the kid's stare, his expression unreadable. "Guess I am the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something else behind it. Amusement. Interest. Maybe something else. "Welcome to Richmond, man." Dorian did not say anything. He just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was just the beginning. The first day at Richmond High had been quiet. Too quiet. That eerie calm before the storm. But by lunch, Dorian knew exactly where he stood. He walked into the cafeteria, scanning for a place to sit. The tables were packed, students in their usual groups, lost in conversations that did not include him. He had been through this before. New town, new school. Same looks, same unspoken message. "You do not belong here." It was subtle but clear. The way the talking died down when he passed. The quick glances before eyes darted away. A few students whispered. Dorian caught snippets. "Is he new?" "Yeah. Never seen him before." "What's a guy like him doing here?" That last one was not a question. It was a warning. He ignored it and kept moving, eyes locked on an empty seat near a guy who was too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It was not ideal, but it would do. That was when he heard it. "You lost?" The voice was smooth, confident. the kind that belonged to someone who had never been told no before. Dorian turned, and there he was. Bryce Tanner. Blonde, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in privilege. The type of guy who walked through life untouched, never challenged, never questioned. His smirk was casual, but there was something behind it, something sharp, something that told Dorian he was not just asking a question. Dorian exhaled slowly, keeping his face unreadable. Did not know I needed a map. Bryce chuckled, leaning back in his seat. His friends snickered. Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here. Dorian did not miss the hesitation in his tone, the unspoken part of that sentence. Not a lot of guys like you around here. He met Bryce's stare and held it. He did not shrink, did not flinch, just looked. The smirk widened, but there was something else in Bryce's expression now. Amusement, interest, a challenge. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man," Bryce said, his voice light. But there was something in the way he said it that made it feel like a test, like he was waiting to see how Dorian would respond. Dorian did not. He just sat down and picked up his fork. That should have been the end of it. But Bryce was the kind of guy who never let things go. It started small. A few whispered comments in the hallways, just loud enough for Dorian to hear. Did not know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last. He ignored them. He had been through this before. The waiting game. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see if he would snap, get angry, lash out. But Dorian had learned long ago, a lion does not flinch when the hyenas bark. Still, Bryce was not the type to get bored easily. He was used to control, used to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted now was for Dorian to break. The first real test came by the lockers. Dorian was switching out his books when it happened. A sudden, sharp bump. A shoulder slamming into his back, hard enough to knock him forward. His hand caught the metal locker just before his face could hit it. A chuckle. Oops. Dorian turned slowly. Bryce stood there, his smirk lazy, flanked by a few of his friends. Did not see you there. Dorian inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. His fingers tightened on his book, but he did not react. He just kept his expression blank, his body still. Bryce grinned. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool. Real cool." There was something mocking in the way he said it. Dorian let a slow beat pass, then shut his locker. He did not acknowledge Bryce, did not give him the satisfaction of a response. Just turned and walked away. Behind him, Bryce let out a low chuckle. "Catch you later, new guy." Dorian heard the laughter as he walked down the hall, the background noise of a game he had no interest in playing. But Bryce was not done yet. The second time was in the cafeteria. Dorian was heading toward the trash cans when a foot shot out in front of him. It was not subtle. It was not an accident. He barely caught himself before he could fall, his tray clattering onto the counter. A wave of laughter followed. Bryce held up his hands in mock innocence. "Relax, man. It was a joke." Dorian did not look at him, did not say a word, just stepped over Bryce's foot and kept walking. The laughter grew louder. "Too easy," someone muttered. Dorian clenched his jaw, but he kept moving. His uncle's voice echoed in his head. "Walk away. Keep your hands in your pockets. Do not give them what they want." So he let it go. But Bryce was still not done. The third time? The third time, Bryce made sure it was not just a joke. It was after school. Most of the students had already left. The parking lot half empty. Dorian had just finished up in the library, taking his time before heading home. He barely stepped outside before... Smack. Something hit his back. Hard. His body jolted forward, his balance nearly breaking. Laughter. He turned slowly. Bryce stood there, flanked by Nick, Kyle, and a few other guys whose names did not matter. Bryce still held his drink cup, the last few drops dripping from his fingers. "Damn. My bad," Bryce said, not even pretending to sound sorry. Dorian glanced down. His hoodie was splattered with soda. Ice cubes scattered at his feet. Silence stretched between them. Other students lingering in the lot had stopped to watch. Dorian inhaled through his nose. "Steady." Bryce smirked. "Come on, man. Say something." Dorian did not. He just started to walk past him. And that was when Bryce shoved him. It was not playful. It was not just a joke. It was forceful, deliberate, a challenge. Dorian stumbled back a step. His breath was calm. His fingers flexed at his sides. Bryce laughed. "What? You scared?" Nick stepped forward, grinning. "Nah, man. He's just soft." Dorian took one last deep breath. Then, without a word, he set down his backpack. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Oh, You got something to say now? Dorian did not answer. He just rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. Man, that was as far as he got. Dorian moved. Dorian had been through this before. New school, same game, same players. The ones who walked past him without a second glance. The ones who stared a second too long before looking away. The ones who whispered just loud enough for him to hear. And then there were the ones like Bryce Tanner. The predators. Bryce was not just another high school bully. He was privileged, protected, powerful. The kind of guy who had always been at the top, untouchable, unchallenged. And that meant Dorian was a problem. Bryce thrived on control. He was used to people playing by his rules. And right now, Dorian was not playing along. It started with a nudge. Not just a casual brush of shoulders. This was intentional, deliberate. Dorian had been at his locker between classes, swapping out books, when he felt it. A hard slam against his side. His shoulder crashed into metal, the impact sending a sharp jolt through his ribs. The lockers rattled. Laughter. Oops, Bryce said, all mock innocence, stepping back like it had been an accident. Dorian exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of every stare in the hallway. He could hear the snickers. He could taste the tension. He turned his head, looked at Bryce. Not angry, not flustered. Just looked. Bryce smirked. Did not see you there, man. Dorian did not take the bait. He shut his locker, did not react, did not flinch, just walked away. And that was when he heard it. The one thing Bryce could not stand. Silence. No fear. No frustration. No reaction. Nothing. Bryce frowned slightly. But before he could say anything, one of his friends chuckled. You see that? Too easy. Bryce laughed. But it was forced. Dorian kept walking. His uncle's voice echoed in his head. A lion does not flinch when the hyenas bark. But hyenas do not stop barking. The next move came at lunch. Dorian had just grabbed his tray, scanning for an open seat, when he heard it. Heads up, new guy. A foot shot out in front of him. Dorian caught himself just before he could fall, his body jerking forward, the tray rattling in his hands. Laughter. Not just from Bryce, but from the table behind him. Dorian let out a slow breath. Steady. Controlled. He did not look at Bryce. Did not give him the reaction he wanted. He just stepped over Bryce's foot and kept walking. The laughter behind him got louder. Man. Come on, Bryce said, his voice dripping with amusement. It was a joke. Dorian ignored him. Bryce leaned back in his chair, watching as Dorian sat down at a table across the cafeteria. He was frustrated. He was used to easy targets. And Dorian? Dorian was not easy. By the time the last bell rang, the tension was thick. Dorian could feel it like a storm on the horizon. It was not over. Not yet. Because Bryce was the kind of guy who only had one setting. Push harder. Dorian had just stepped outside when he heard it. Hey, new guy. His entire body went still. He did not need to turn to know who it was. The voices, the tone, the energy. Bryce, Nick, Kyle, a few others. A pack. Dorian exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Then, smack. Something slammed into his back. Hard. His body jolted forward, his breath catching. A soda cup bounced onto the pavement, ice cubes scattering around his feet. Laughter. Slow. Mocking. Dorian turned. Bryce stood there, holding the empty cup, the last few drops dripping from his fingers. Damn. My bad, Bryce said, grinning. Did not see you there. Silence. More students had stopped to watch. Some lingered near their cars. Some pretended not to be watching but absolutely were. Dorian looked down at his hoodie. Soda. Sticky. Soaking into the fabric. His jaw tightened, but his face remained calm. He was not going to play their game. He turned, walking past Bryce. That should have been the end of it. But Bryce was not done. A shove. Not hard enough to knock him over, but hard enough to make a statement. A challenge. Dorian stumbled back a step, caught himself. Every part of him screamed to react. But he did not. Bryce laughed. What? You scared? Nick stepped forward, grinning. Nah, man. He is just soft. Dorian closed his eyes for a second. His uncle's voice echoed in his head. Do not give them what they want. But Bryce was not looking for a laugh anymore. He was looking for a fight. And Dorian? Dorian was done walking away. Slowly, he set down his backpack. Bryce raised an eyebrow. Oh, you got something to say now? Dorian did not answer. He just rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. Man, that was as far as he got. Dorian moved, a left feint, quick, sharp, just enough to make Bryce react. And then, a right hook, straight to the ribs. The sound was sickening. Bryce's breath shot out in a choked gasp. His body folded. But Dorian was not done. A pivot, an uppercut. Perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back, his legs gave out, and before he could even think about staying on his feet, he hit the pavement. Hard. Silence. Nick and the others stared, mouths open. Bryce groaned, rolling onto his side. Dorian stepped back, adjusting his hoodie, his breath steady, controlled. Then, finally, he spoke. "You done?" Bryce did not answer. He just coughed. Dorian looked at the others. Anyone else? No one moved. Dorian grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and walked away. No celebration, no victory lap. Because this was not the end. It was just the beginning. The parking lot was half empty by the time Dorian stepped out of the library. Most students had already left, their cars pulling away in the dimming afternoon light. The quiet should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like a warning. Dorian adjusted the strap of his backpack, his footsteps steady as he moved toward the sidewalk. Then, a voice. "Hey, new guy!" His body went still. Not from fear, not from surprise, but from recognition. He had felt it coming all day. The moment in the hallway, the trip in the cafeteria, the whispers, the eyes on him. Bryce Tanner was not the type to let things go. Dorian turned his head slightly. He did not need to see them to know they were there. Bryce, Nick, Kyle, a few others, background noise. But Bryce? Bryce was the one who mattered, the one who needed everyone watching. And right now, he had an audience. Dorian exhaled slowly. Then, impact. Something slammed into his back. Hard. The sticky splash of liquid soaked into his hoodie, the cold seeping through the fabric. A soda cup hit the pavement, bouncing before rolling to a stop. Laughter. Slow. Mocking. He turned. Bryce stood there, holding the empty cup, his fingers dripping with the last few drops. His smirk was not amused anymore. It was hungry. "Damn. My bad," Bryce said, grinning. "Did not see you there." Silence stretched between them. Students, the ones who had been lingering by their cars, were now openly watching. The show had begun. Dorian looked down at his hoodie. The dark stain spread across the fabric. His jaw tightened. Bryce tilted his head, waiting. "Come on, man. Say something." Dorian did not. He turned to walk past him, and that was when Bryce shoved him. Not a tap, not a joke. A full, forceful push, enough to knock him back. A few gasps. A couple of students murmured. Dorian stumbled a step, caught himself, steadied his breath. Bryce laughed. "What? You scared?" Nick stepped forward, grinning. "Nah, man. He is just soft." More laughter. Dorian closed his eyes. His uncle's voice echoed in his head. "Do not give them what they want." He had spent his entire life walking away, controlling himself, proving that his silence was not weakness. It was strength. But right now, Bryce was not just looking for a laugh. He was looking for a win. And Dorian was done letting him have it. Slowly, he set his backpack down. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You got something to say now?" Dorian did not answer. He rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. "Man, that was as far as he got." Dorian moved. Fast, precise, ruthless. A left feint, just enough to make Bryce react. Then, a right hook, straight to the ribs. The sound was sickening. Bryce's breath shot out in a choked gasp. His body folded. But Dorian was not done. A pivot, an uppercut. Perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back. His legs gave out, and before he could even think about staying on his feet, he hit the pavement, hard. Silence. Nick and the others stared, mouths open. Bryce groaned, rolling onto his side. Dorian stepped back, adjusting his hoodie, his breath steady, controlled. Then, finally, he spoke. "You done?" Bryce did not answer. He just coughed. Dorian looked at the others. Anyone else? No one moved. Dorian grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and walked away. No celebration, no victory lap. Because this was not the end. It was just the beginning. The laughter had not stopped yet. Bryce was still grinning. Nick and Kyle were still watching, waiting. And Dorian? He was done waiting. Slowly, he set his backpack down. The motion was so casual, so deliberate, that Bryce actually laughed. "Oh? What, you gonna cry now?" Dorian did not answer. did not flinch, did not break eye contact. Bryce's grin widened. "Man, you—" And then Dorian moved. Fast, precise, unstoppable. A left feint, not a real punch. Just enough to make Bryce react. Bryce flinched, raising his arms, exactly what Dorian wanted. And in that split second, Dorian struck. A right hook. Sharp, clean, brutal. His fist buried into Bryce's ribs. The sound was sickening. Bryce gasped. His body folded instantly like all the air had been ripped from his lungs. The laughter? Gone. The smirk? Wiped off his face. His knees buckled. But Dorian was not done. A pivot. A shift. And then, an uppercut. Perfectly timed. It landed clean. Bryce's head snapped back. His eyes went wide. And before he could even think about staying on his feet, he was falling. Hard. The pavement hit him before his brain could process what had happened. Silence. Not just from Bryce. From everyone. Nick, Kyle, the others. Every single student who had been watching from a distance, waiting for the show. But this was not the show they expected. Dorian stepped back, his breathing even, his posture calm, controlled. He adjusted his hoodie. Then, finally, he looked up, at the others, at Nick, Kyle, the ones who had been laughing just seconds ago. Anyone else? His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. No one spoke. No one moved. Bryce was still groaning, rolling onto his side, struggling to catch his breath, struggling to process what just happened. Dorian picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and walked away. No celebration, no victory lap, because this was not over. It was just the beginning. By the next morning, everyone knew. Dorian did not have to check his phone. He could see it in the way people stared, the whispers that started just as he walked past, the way some students smirked, nodding at him like he had won something, the way others looked at him, wary, careful, afraid. Bryce was not at school. No one said it out loud, but they all knew why. A guy like Bryce did not show his face after something like that. His friends, Nick, Kyle, the rest of them, they kept their distance. Dorian could feel their eyes on him, but none of them had the nerve to say anything. Not after what happened in the parking lot. By lunch, the story had already grown bigger than the truth. New guy knocked Bryce out cold. Dude did not even last a full minute. I heard he trained with professionals. Each version stretched the truth just a little more. Dorian ignored all of it. He was not looking for validation. He was not looking for anything. But then, as he passed a table, he heard something else. And this one hit different. Of course he fought. What do you expect? Yeah, you know how they are. Soft words. But not soft enough. Dorian turned his head slightly. A couple of girls. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry. Her expression curled like she had smelled something bad. When she realized he had heard, she quickly looked away. His stomach clenched. And just like that, he knew. It did not matter. Not to them. No matter what he did. No matter the reason. No matter how much he had tried to walk away first. To some people, he was just another violent thug. The cafeteria suddenly felt too small. Too loud. Too familiar. He had seen this before. Different schools. Different places. Same looks. Same judgments. Same narrative. This is why they do not belong here. The words were not spoken aloud, but he heard them anyway. And that stung more than any punch. He clenched his jaw, exhaled slowly. Then he picked up his tray and walked away, because he was done listening. And more than that, he was not done proving them wrong. Dorian was halfway out of the gym when he heard it. "Lawson? Got a minute?" He paused, turned. Coach Harrison stood near the lockers, arms crossed. His expression? Unreadable. Dorian exhaled, already knowing what this was about. Slowly, he walked over. Coach studied him for a second before speaking. "I heard what happened. No judgment, no accusation, just stating a fact." Dorian said nothing. Coach nodded, like he expected that. "Figured you had your reasons." Dorian's jaw tightened, because he had. And yet, here he was. The fight had happened. People had talked, and nothing had changed. Coach sighed. "But let me ask you something, Lawson." His tone shifted. Softer, sharper. "Did that fight change anything?" Dorian frowned, opened his mouth, then stopped. Because he knew the answer. Bryce? He would come back. If not tomorrow, next week. The cycle would repeat. A punch did not change mindsets, did not erase prejudice, did not fix what was broken. Coach tilted his head. See, that is the thing, Lawson. Guys like Bryce, they do not really lose. Not in a way that sticks. Dorian clenched his fists. Because Coach was right. Coach sighed. But you are different. Dorian exhaled. What are you saying? Coach nodded toward the wrestling mats. I have been asking the boxing coach to send me a few kids. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use? Dorian blinked. Wrestling? Coach grinned. Look, I know you can handle yourself. That much is obvious. Dorian said nothing, because it was true. But there is a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power. Dorian's breath hitched. Because those words, they hit different. Coach sighed. I have seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. Dorian looked away, because he knew that too. Coach continued. You already proved you are strong, Lawson. Then he stepped closer. Now prove you are more than that. Dorian hesitated, because for so long, fighting had been survival. A way to stand his ground. A way to show them he was not weak. But the way Coach said it, this was different. Dorian inhaled, exhaled. Then without a word, he walked away. But for the first time, he was thinking. Maybe, just maybe, fighting was about more than fists. Dorian sat on his bed, his back against the wall, staring at the worn-out boxing gloves on his desk. His uncle's gloves. The ones that had been with him since he was a kid. The ones that had saved him. His fingers traced the laces. He could still hear his uncle's voice. A lion does not flinch when the hyenas bark. He had lived by that lesson. But tonight, it felt different. His mind kept replaying the fight. The way Bryce's body had folded when the punch landed. The way everyone had stared at him the next day, half with respect, half with fear. And then, the whispers. Just another violent thug. That stuck deeper than any punch. Because it never changed. No matter what he did. No matter how much he controlled himself. No matter how many times he walked away. They had already decided who he was. Dorian exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had spent years fighting, not just with his fists, but with his presence, his very existence in places that did not want him. And for what? Would anything have been different if he had let Bryce win? Number. Because they would have found another way to make him the villain. But Coach's words echoed in his head. There is a difference between winning a fight and owning your power. Dorian sat there, staring at the gloves. Then, slowly, he put them back in the drawer. Not because he was done fighting, but because he finally understood. It was not about proving he was strong. It was about proving he was more. The next morning, he walked into the gym, his heartbeat steady. Coach Harrison stood near the wrestling mats, clipboard in hand. When he saw Dorian, his lips curled into a knowing smirk. Took you long enough? Dorian huffed a short laugh. Then, he looked Coach straight in the eye and said, Where do I sign up? Coach grinned, tossing him a form. Welcome to the team, Lawson. Because he had always known. Dorian was more than just his fists. Richmond High would not forget the fight. Not today. Not for a long time. But Dorian. He was not just the kid who threw a punch. He was the kid who walked away from the next one. He had stepped onto campus as the outsider. He had been mocked, pushed, tested. And when he fought back, people thought that was his story. But they were wrong. Because Dorian did not just fight. He chose. He chose who he was going to be. He chose what battles were worth it. And more importantly, which ones weren't. Bryce? Bryce would be fine. People like him always landed on their feet. But what Dorian had done? He had taken control of his own story. And that was something no one could take away from him. By the end of the week, the whispers had shifted. The stares were not just curiosity anymore. They were respect. Because he was not just the new black kid. He was not just the fighter. He was Dorian Lawson. And from now on, he would be the one deciding who he was. Not them, not Bryce, him, because that was a fight he would always win.